Back in September, the US military dispatched a sizable force near Venezuela, yet one that was still moderate in size, limiting what it could pull off. So the US mostly settled with intercepting and destroying what it called narco cartels' speedboats. But since then, the US made further preparations and has sent additional forces. It seems the goal of toppling Nicolas Maduro, Venezuelan president, and changing its authoritarian government might be in its sights. This video will explore what military options might help the US achieve that and what sort of attacks the US might perform. Since our previous video in September, US forces stationed near Venezuela, en route to Venezuela, or patrolling near Venezuela have increased dramatically. More Burke-class destroyers were added, as were a special operations ship and resupply ships. Plus the Ford aircraft carrier, US most modern and biggest carrier, is en route to the area, or has perhaps even already arrived, accompanied by one Burke destroyer and a resupply ship. Back in September, additional airbase work was observed in one location in Puerto Rico. By November, 3 bases had seen modifications, including a larger apron, enlarged taxiways, and possibly even a longer runway, in addition to various mobile control and security equipment brought in. Roosevelt Roads Base and Rafael Hernandez Airport, both on Puerto Rico, saw said additional work done, as did Henry Rawlinson Airport at U.S. Virgin Islands territory east of Puerto Rico. The U.S. wouldn't have gone into such infrastructure investment unless there are gonna be some serious air operations done from all those bases. Keep in mind the U.S. also has the Guantanamo base in Cuba, which in theory could also be used if beefed up further, but for political reasons that might be the last resort. At least 40 but probably more C-17 flights were observed into Puerto Rico since September, bringing in various equipment. The US is evidently readying up for something bigger than was evident back in September. Now, we won't talk about Venezuelan forces much, as those are far from being a factor. Even if Venezuelan military were to react to US strikes, even if enough of its air defenses and air force survived, and even if enough were willing to try to attack US assets, there's hardly anything Venezuela could do. At best, some lucky interceptions of US planes and rotorcraft might happen. The media were full of news of Russia sending air defenses, but so far a single Ilyushin-76 plane was observed coming to Venezuela. At best, it could have carried something like a few Panzer vehicles or some Buk missiles or launchers. It is possible a few more flights sneaked past undetected, but even so, it's not easy to transport a whole air defense battery by air. A single Ilyushin-76 might transport 2 Buk launcher vehicles, so the whole battery would require close to a dozen flights. So even if Venezuelan air defenses have been beefed up a little, it's not gonna amount to much. Venezuela would be wise to disperse those assets as much as possible and use them very sporadically, basically never using their radars as primary means of aircraft detection, even if it means relying on other smaller radars or even relying on other obsolete means for detection. Then, if close enough and if lucky enough to stop and shoot quickly, it might catch some unlucky US low or medium altitude aircraft or rotorcraft off guard. Such an ambush would increase the chances of the US detecting the SAM battery and blowing it up. With the massive number of satellite side-looking radar-equipped surveillance planes peeking at Venezuela from a few hundred miles away, and probably US informants on the ground, it's quite plausible the US is already tracking most of Venezuelan SAM batteries. Venezuelan Air Force would hardly be a threat. It would get bombed on the ground by cruise missiles and standoff bombs. At best, Venezuela might be able to disperse some planes beforehand, and likely keep them hidden during the whole ordeal. Any and every airstrip in Venezuela is likely monitored 24/7 and would be hard-pressed to launch Su-30 missions, let alone successful ones. And anyway, Su-30s are 30 years old technology nowadays. Perhaps the biggest threat to the US might be various shoulder-launched missiles, if the US goes for troop insertions deep inside Venezuela, via rotorcraft. Venezuela has received thousands of Russian Igla manpads, on top of having some Western manpads as well. With the rotor craft being slow and with plenty of tree-line protection, shoulder-launch missile operators could detect targets early enough to fire off some shots into mostly helpless targets. But all that really depends on what the US wants to do. Here are some possibilities. The US is already likely doing CIA-covered missions inside Venezuela. Said missions were publicly approved. The forces the US has are still really insufficient for an invasion. 3 assault ships can land some 2,200 Marines in one go, but even if the US has further troops prepped, it's unlikely to be a figure many times over, and it would be likely to take days and weeks until further troops are used. But a full-scale invasion of Venezuela is likely not what the US is after. There's one immediate goal after Trump makes the final decision and after legal go-ahead for attack is produced: to change who runs Venezuela. That means toppling Maduro. There are several ways to go about it, but those all boil down to these two: either to pressure Maduro and his clique to flee, or to convince people around Maduro to rise up and get rid of him. Now, everything done so far by the US is likely a form of pressure. The US hopes Maduro will get scared and simply leave the country, leaving a political vacuum that then the US could influence and control. Even the slow but inevitable cruise of the Ford carrier to the Caribbean is part of that show. If pure intimidation fails, bombs may start falling. At that point, it's less likely the US would be content with letting Maduro flee. So then the option of pressuring others into performing a coup d'etat might be more likely. And who gets bombed, how much, and where the US forces go, that can help convince those people around Maduro to topple him. We are not talking about the general population, but about people enabling Maduro's governance. While a lot of this is speculative, it's plausible that a lot of the military in Venezuela is integrated into and or connected with various drug cartels. So it would be easy to imagine the following deal. As long as Maduro's government doesn't interfere with the drug deals, the military stays loyal. Now, if the US were to start attacking narco cartels' assets, especially with an under-the-table promise to stop once Maduro is out, cartels might rebel against Maduro, and with them a lot of the armed forces, including higher-up echelons. Action against cartels might include US troop insertions, as we are not talking about tens of thousands of troops opposing those. And if anti-cartel ops aren't enough, the US might go for long-term pressure, like bombing and raiding Venezuela's oil production and oil export assets, refineries, ships, and so on. Venezuela's economy has been in tatters for a long time, and its main driver has been oil export, run by a government-owned company. And oil makes up for 2/3 of all the country's exports. Even more worryingly for Maduro, oil exports make up for half the total state budget. If those stop, the country will quickly go bankrupt, and then all hell can break loose, with possibly many of the officers around Maduro switching sides once they realize the day they stop getting paid may be close. Of course, such strikes would come in a package with the general show of force, US bombing Venezuelan military sites, bases, and a campaign of decapitation of various leadership around Maduro and his generals, be it via airstrikes or assassinations, with the ultimate goal of seeding fear around Maduro's ranks. No one would know who can be killed next, unless Maduro is toppled. So that's where we are at. The US aims to pressure the cartels and generals around Maduro to get him out of power. It's a plan that has a high likelihood of working depending on the amount of pressure applied, which means that if at first Maduro doesn't go, the US might be bringing in even more forces, prolonging the whole bombing campaign. Right now, no final decision has been made, but the US is building up those forces and bases for a reason. Time will tell. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.